By instinct, Churchill was also against. But the Treasury experts said that going back to the clear, transparent system of the pre-war world would make the city great again. But if a system is clear and transparent, it's also a ruthless exposer of weakness. All very glorious to put on an old suit of armour, unless you're too weak to walk in it. Churchill brooded as they argued it out over the table, but by the end of the meal, he'd been won over. Britain was going to have to go back onto the gold standard. But there was no mood of celebration over this dinner. As one of them put it, it will be hell. And hell it was. The return to the gold standard made British exports more expensive, including coal. And with more than 1 million miners, the coal industry was the country's largest employer. To stay in business, the mine owners announced a cut in wages and an even longer working day. An industrial dispute was soon coming to the boil. The mine owners stood firm. Then at 1 minute to midnight on Monday the 3rd of May 1926, the TUC called a general strike. Quietly, the government had been planning for this moment, and they now sent telegrams all across the country with the single code word, action. All Army and Navy leave was immediately cancelled. 2 battleships dropped anchor in the Mersey. 2 infantry battalions marched through Liverpool. Bring it on! If the revolution was coming, the authorities were determined to show they were ready for it. On the first morning of the strike, Britain came to a virtual standstill. But the government already had a small army of strike-breaking volunteers at its disposal. City gents shoveled coal at the gasworks. The Ranelagh Polo Club patrolled central London as special constables on their ponies. Titled ladies and debutantes turned up to organise food supplies. One posh drama student wrote to her mother about the gentlemen volunteers on the London Tube. It's perfectly mad to hear a beautiful Oxford voice crying, "Uxbridge and Harrow train," rather than Uxbridge and Arra. It's perfectly jolly and such an improvement on the ordinary humdrum state of things. But it was the railways that attracted the real toffs. The Honourable Mrs. Beaumont led stable duty at Paddington. Lord Monkswell was a signalman at Marylebone. And the Honourable Lionel Guest successfully drove a train all the way from Liverpool Street to Yarmouth. After a few days, many of the strike-breaking volunteers developed a healthy respect for the working classes they had often never come across before. One of them said, "I found much of my sympathy was more with the men than with the employers or the government. I had never realized the appalling poverty which existed."
By the 5th day of the strike, London was running short of flour and bread. At 4 a.m, the government sent a convoy of lorries and armoured cars to take food from the docks by force. Restless crowds of strikers looked on, but didn't interfere. This was the psychological turning point.
At noon, on the 9th day of the strike, Arthur Pugh, the leader of the TUC, contacted Baldwin to tell him that the strike was to be terminated forthwith. Baldwin wasn't quite sure he'd heard properly. "Forthwith," replied Pugh. "That means immediately." And Baldwin said, "I thank God for your decision."
The strike was over, and for some, the good times still rolled on. In June 1928, a crudely printed party invitation began arriving at some of the best addresses in Mayfair and Belgravia. This was to be the most outrageous party of the season, and it was being held at the local swimming baths. On the guest list was a young Oxford graduate called Tom Dryburgh, later a communist, MI5 spy, and chairman of the Labour Party. He'd just started writing for the Daily Express gossip column, The Talk of London.
Writing anonymously as the Dragoman, Tom Dryburgh reported visions of great rubber horses and flowers floating about on the water. Everything was illuminated by coloured spotlights, and many of the guests had brought 2 or 3 costumes to change into as the night wore on. Dryburgh kept rushing out to the nearest public telephone to file his copy. This was a hoot, but also a scoop.
The guests included the brightest of the bright young things, Mayfair debutantes, the children of lords and government ministers, and a slender it girl with a weakness for hard drugs called Brenda Dean Paul.
Brenda Dean Paul remembered seeing unshockable old dowagers glued to the only available seats in the dimly lit cubicles by the side of the pool. She said they seemed quite contented, like plump hens, their lorgnettes fixed on the dripping parade.
The bath and bottle party would turn out to be the beginning of the end for Britain's roaring 20s. For an economic storm was brewing across the Atlantic. And from the dealing rooms on Wall Street, the chilly winds would soon be blowing all the way to Belgravia.
For the bright young things, the end of the bath and bottle party was a premonition. Modern times were giving way to hard times, and soon the off-colour cocktails and the crushed rose petals and the glittering pool were only a memory. The good times were drifting away on 1,000 bobbing champagne corks, and as the sunlight filtered through the skylights, Britain's fast set were weaving and wobbling their weary way home.